I was standing in my driveway on a Tuesday morning in late March when I saw Brenda Montgomery marching toward me with her phone held up like a weapon. And I knew my peaceful week was about to turn into another HOA nightmare. My name is Greg Hamilton, and I had just finished connecting my new propane tanks to my outdoor kitchen setup in my backyard. I live in Sunset Ridge, a planned community in Henderson, Nevada, just outside Las Vegas. The desert sun was already warming up the day, and I was looking forward to grilling some steaks that evening. I had purchased 2 standard 20-pound propane tanks, the kind you can find at any hardware store, and installed them properly according to all safety regulations. I had even gone the extra mile and built a small ventilated storage area for them against the side of my house, painted to match my exterior walls. Brenda was the vice president of our HOA board, a woman in her mid-50s with an unfortunately perfect name for her personality. She wore her blonde hair in that specific style that screamed, "I need to speak to your manager," and she had a talent for finding violations where none existed. Her entire existence seemed dedicated to making the lives of everyone in our neighborhood as complicated as possible. "Greg Hamilton," she called out, still 20 feet away. "I need to speak with you about your blatant safety violations." I wiped my hands on my jeans and walked toward her, trying to keep my expression neutral. "Morning, Brenda. What safety violations are you talking about?" She stopped at the edge of my driveway, keeping a theatrical distance as if my property might explode at any moment. "Those propane tanks I can see from the street. Do you have any idea how dangerous those are? We have rules about this sort of thing." "I checked the HOA bylaws before I installed them," I said calmly. "There's nothing that prohibits propane tanks for residential use. They're stored properly, they're the standard size, and they're in a ventilated area." Brenda's eyes narrowed. "They're an eyesore and a hazard." "I'm calling the fire marshal. We'll see what he has to say about your little setup." "Be my guest," I replied, gesturing toward my backyard. "I followed all the safety guidelines. I've got nothing to hide." She pulled out her phone and started dialing right there in front of me, maintaining eye contact the entire time like she was trying to intimidate me. I just stood there and waited. This was not my first rodeo with Brenda and the HOA board. 6 months ago, she had complained about my mailbox being the wrong shade of black. Before that, it was my trash cans being visible from the street on a non-collection day, even though I had been loading them into my truck to take to the dump. The woman had a gift for manufactured outrage. After a brief conversation with whoever answered at the fire department, Brenda hung up and gave me a satisfied smile. "They're sending someone out this afternoon. I suggest you prepare yourself for some citations and fines." "I'll be here," I said simply. She turned on her heel and walked back toward her own house, 3 doors down, already pulling out her phone again, probably to text the other board members about her latest victory before it had even happened. I went back inside and called my buddy Marcus, who worked in construction and knew all the local building codes. "Hey man, quick question. My HOA is calling the fire marshal about my propane tanks. I followed all the guidelines, right?" Marcus laughed on the other end. "Dude, you're fine. I helped you plan that setup. It's textbook safe. 20-pound tanks, proper ventilation, 10 feet from any ignition source, clearly marked. The fire marshal is going to take one look and give you a thumbs up." That's what I figured, but Brenda's got me second-guessing everything. "Brenda Montgomery. That's your HOA lady. You know her. My sister lives in your neighborhood, 2 streets over. Brenda tried to fine her for having a vegetable garden that was too visible from the street. Your HOA is notorious, man. Everyone around here knows about Sunset Ridge." That made me feel simultaneously better and worse. Better because it confirmed I was not crazy for thinking Brenda was unreasonable. Worse because it meant I was stuck in a neighborhood with a legitimately terrible reputation. The fire marshal arrived at 2:30 that afternoon. I had been working from home in my office when I heard the truck pull up. I looked out the window and saw an official Henderson Fire Department vehicle parking in front of my house. A man in his early 40s stepped out, wearing the standard uniform and carrying a clipboard. Behind him, I could see Brenda practically sprinting from her house to join the inspection. I met them in my driveway. "Good afternoon. I'm Greg Hamilton, the homeowner." The fire marshal extended his hand. "Deputy Fire Marshal Robert Chen. I understand there's a concern about propane storage on your property." "Yes, sir. I installed two 20-pound propane tanks for my outdoor kitchen. They're around back. I'd be happy to show you." Brenda interjected before we could move. "They're clearly visible from the street and pose a significant danger to the entire neighborhood. We have children living here, Deputy Marshal." Marshal Chen gave her a polite nod but addressed me. "Let's take a look, Mr. Hamilton." I led them through my side gate into the backyard. My property was not huge, but it was a decent size for the neighborhood. I had a covered patio with an outdoor kitchen setup that included a built-in grill, a small refrigerator, and a sink. The propane tanks were stored in the ventilated enclosure I had built about 8 feet away from the grill, with proper hoses running to the appliance. Marshal Chen walked around the setup, examining everything closely. He checked the distance from the house, looked at the ventilation in the storage enclosure, inspected the connections, and even pulled out a measuring tape to verify clearances. Brenda stood nearby with her arms crossed, a confident smirk on her face that was already starting to fade as the inspection went on. "Mr. Hamilton," Marshal Chen said after about 10 minutes, "can you tell me who installed these connections?" "I did, sir. I followed the manufacturer's instructions and the local fire code requirements I found on the city website." He nodded slowly. "And do you have the documentation for these tanks? Purchase receipts, certification labels, that sort of thing?" "Yes, sir. They're inside." "I can grab them if you need to see them." "That won't be necessary. I can see the certification labels on the tanks themselves." He made a few notes on his clipboard and then turned to face both of us. "Mrs. Montgomery, Mr. Hamilton's propane storage setup is completely compliant with all local fire codes. The tanks are properly sized, correctly installed, adequately ventilated, and maintained at safe distances from all potential ignition sources. There are no violations here." Brenda's face went through several interesting color changes. "But they're so close to the house. And what if they leak? What if they explode?" "Madam, these are standard propane tanks used safely in millions of homes across the country. Mr. Hamilton has taken extra precautions that exceed the minimum requirements. I have no concerns about this setup whatsoever." Marshal Chen made a final note on his clipboard and then looked at Brenda with a more serious expression. "While I'm here, though, I should mention that the fire department has been meaning to conduct a routine inspection of the community clubhouse. Would you be able to let me in to take a look?" The color drained from Brenda's face entirely. "The clubhouse, right now, if it's not too much trouble. Since I'm already here in the neighborhood, it would save us a trip later. The clubhouse is used for community gatherings, correct?" "Yes. But I'm not sure if I have the keys with me right now, and I'm sure we can track down someone with access," Marshal Chen said pleasantly, but there was something in his tone that suggested this was not really a request. "It's a public building used for assembly purposes. It requires regular fire safety inspections." I stayed quiet, sensing that something interesting was about to happen. Brenda fumbled with her phone, making a call. From what I could hear of her side of the conversation, she was calling Patricia, the HOA president, with increasing desperation in her voice. 20 minutes later, Patricia Drummond arrived in her white SUV, looking flustered. She was in her late 50s, tall and thin, with gray hair pulled back in a bun. She had always been slightly less aggressive than Brenda, but no less committed to the HOA's reign of petty tyranny. Deputy Marshal Chen, I'm Patricia Drummond, the HOA president. I understand you want to inspect the clubhouse. That's correct, Mrs. Drummond. It's just a routine safety inspection. Nothing to be concerned about. The way Patricia and Brenda exchanged glances suggested they were, in fact, quite concerned. We all walked the 2 blocks to the clubhouse, a single-story building that sat near the neighborhood's main entrance. It was used for HOA meetings, community events, and private rentals by residents. I had been inside a few times for mandatory HOA meetings, but I had never paid much attention to the details of the building itself. Patricia unlocked the front door, and we stepped into the main room. It was a large open space with a kitchen area at one end, a small stage at the other, and several folding tables and chairs stacked along the walls. The carpet was a generic beige, and the walls were decorated with framed photos of neighborhood events and a large copy of the HOA bylaws. Marshal Chen immediately went to work, and I could see his expression change within the first minute. He checked the exit signs, examined the doors, looked at the electrical outlets, and inspected the kitchen area. His note-taking became more frequent and more vigorous. How many people does this space accommodate for events? He asked. Patricia cleared her throat. We've held events with up to 150 people. And when was the last fire safety inspection conducted? Another meaningful silence. I'd have to check our records. Marshal Chen walked over to the kitchen area and opened the cabinet under the sink. He pulled out several bottles of cleaning supplies, examining them. You're storing flammable materials in an unlocked cabinet in a public assembly space. That's a violation. He pointed to the electrical outlets. These outlets are not GFCI protected in a kitchen area. That's another violation. He gestured to the exit at the far end of the room. That emergency exit is blocked by stacked chairs. That's a serious violation. Brenda tried to interject. Those chairs are only there temporarily. We had an event last weekend and haven't finished putting everything away yet. When is the last time your fire extinguishers were inspected? Marshal Chen asked, pointing to a red extinguisher mounted on the wall. He walked over to it and checked the tag. This was last inspected in March of 2022. 3 years ago. These require annual inspections. Patricia's voice became smaller. I'm sure we have records of more recent inspections somewhere. I'll need to see those records. Marshal Chen continued his inspection, finding more issues. The smoke detectors were outdated models that should have been replaced years ago. The carbon monoxide detectors were missing entirely. The electrical panel was not properly labeled. The kitchen stove had a gas leak that was small but detectable. The storage closet was crammed with flammable materials and had no fire suppression system. I watched as Brenda and Patricia's expressions shifted from confusion to panic. This was clearly not going the way they had planned. After 45 minutes of thorough inspection, Marshal Chen gathered us in the main room. I'm going to be straight with you. This clubhouse has multiple serious fire code violations. Some of these are immediately hazardous, and others represent a pattern of negligent maintenance. I'm going to have to issue citations and require immediate remediation of the most serious issues. Until those are addressed, this building cannot be used for public assembly. What does that mean? Patricia asked weakly. It means you're shutting down the clubhouse until these violations are corrected. The gas leak needs to be fixed immediately. The emergency exits must be cleared and kept clear at all times. The electrical issues need to be addressed by a licensed electrician. The fire suppression and detection systems need to be updated. The flammable materials need to be stored properly. And you need to establish a regular inspection and maintenance schedule going forward. He began writing up formal citations on his clipboard, filling out multiple forms in triplicate. You'll receive the full report within 72 hours, along with a deadline for remediation. If the violations are not corrected by the deadline, you'll face daily fines until compliance is achieved. If you continue to use this facility for public assembly before the violations are corrected, you'll face additional penalties and potential criminal charges. Brenda found her voice again, though it had lost much of its earlier confidence. How much are we talking about in fines? The initial citations will total approximately $8,000. The daily fines for non-compliance after the deadline are $500 per day. The cost of actually fixing the violations will depend on the contractors you hire, but you're probably looking at $20,000 to $30,000 in total repairs and upgrades. Patricia looked like she might faint. The HOA's budget was public information, and I knew they had maybe $40,000 in their reserve fund. This was going to be a significant financial hit. Marshal Chen finished his paperwork and handed copies to Patricia. I'll need to see proof of remediation for each violation. You can hire any licensed contractor you choose, but the work will need to pass inspection before I can clear the building for use again. He turned to me. Mr. Hamilton, your propane setup is completely fine. No issues whatsoever. Have a good day. He walked out, leaving the four of us standing in the condemned clubhouse. I should have felt more satisfaction than I did, but mostly I just felt tired. This was going to create a whole new set of problems for the neighborhood. Brenda turned on me immediately. This is your fault. If you hadn't put in those dangerous propane tanks, none of this would have happened. My propane tanks are fine, Brenda. You heard Marshal Chen. This happened because you called for an inspection and he did his job. All these violations were already here. They've probably been here for years. Patricia held up a hand. Everyone just calm down. We need to figure out how to handle this. Greg will need to schedule an emergency board meeting to discuss the remediation plans. I'm not on the board, I reminded her. You don't need me for that. But as a homeowner in the community, you should be informed about how we plan to handle the financial aspects. This is going to require a special assessment. And there it was. A special assessment meant every homeowner in the community would have to pay additional money beyond their regular HOA fees to cover the unexpected expenses. I could already feel the headache forming. How much are we talking about? I asked. Patricia did some quick mental math. With the fines and the repairs, probably around $35,000 total. We have about 200 homes in the community, so that's about $175 per household. That's if everything goes smoothly and there are no additional costs, I pointed out. Contractors around here are not cheap, and once they start tearing into old buildings, they usually find more problems. Brenda was still glaring at me like I had personally sabotaged the clubhouse. We could fight this, get a second opinion. These fire marshals are sometimes overly cautious. Brenda, he found a gas leak. That's not being overly cautious. That's literally dangerous. I was trying to keep my voice level, but my patience was wearing thin. If someone had been using the kitchen and something had ignited that leak, people could have died. Don't be so dramatic, Brenda snapped. I'm not being dramatic. I'm being realistic. You wanted to call the fire marshal to try to get me in trouble over perfectly safe propane tanks, and instead, he found out that the HOA has been maintaining a public building in a dangerous condition. That's on you, not me. Patricia stepped between us. This isn't helping. We need to focus on solutions. I'll call an emergency board meeting for Thursday evening. We'll notify all the homeowners and discuss the situation. In the meantime, we need to cancel all the scheduled events at the clubhouse and hire contractors to start getting quotes on the repairs. I left them there and walked back home, feeling a mix of vindication and apprehension. I had been proven right about my propane tanks, but I knew this was far from over. The neighborhood was about to find out about the special assessment, and people were going to be angry. Some of that anger would be directed at the HOA board, but I suspected some of it would also be directed at me for having been the catalyst for the inspection. That evening, I grilled my steaks on my completely legal and safe outdoor kitchen while watching the sunset over the desert hills. My wife, Amy, came out to join me with a glass of wine. "I heard about the clubhouse situation," she said. "Donna texted me. Her husband serves on the architectural review committee. It's a mess," I confirmed, "but at least my propane tanks are officially approved now." "Do you think they'll try to retaliate?" "Probably, but they don't have much ground to stand on anymore. The fire marshal's approval is pretty definitive." The emergency HOA board meeting was scheduled for Thursday at 7 p.m. to be held in the community's small park since the clubhouse was off-limits. The notification went out to all residents on Wednesday via email and posted notices at the neighborhood mailbox stations. The message was carefully worded to explain that there would be a special assessment due to unexpected maintenance requirements, without going into detail about how those requirements had been discovered. By Thursday afternoon, my phone was ringing off the hook. Apparently, word had spread about what had actually happened, and people wanted to hear my version of events. I gave the honest account to everyone who asked. Brenda had called the fire marshal about my propane tanks. The marshal had approved my setup, and then he had inspected the clubhouse and found multiple violations. When 7 p.m. rolled around, it seemed like every household in the neighborhood had sent at least one representative. The small park was packed with people, many of them looking angry or confused or both. Someone had set up a folding table at the front for the board members, and Patricia, Brenda, and the other 3 board members sat there looking uncomfortable. Patricia called the meeting to order and launched into an explanation of the situation. She tried to keep it vague, referring to a routine inspection that had revealed some maintenance issues, but people were not having it. A man named Ron from 3 streets over stood up. "I heard this wasn't routine at all." I heard Brenda called the fire marshal to harass Greg Hamilton, and it backfired. "Is that true?" Patricia hesitated, and that hesitation was all the confirmation people needed. The crowd erupted into multiple conversations at once. Brenda stood up, her face flushed. "The details of how the inspection came about are not relevant. What matters is that we now know about these violations, and we have to fix them. That's going to require a special assessment of $175 per household." "Like hell I'm paying for that," someone shouted from the back. "You want us to pay for your harassment campaign?" Another voice joined in. "How long have these violations existed? Why weren't we doing regular inspections?" Patricia tried to regain control. "We have been maintaining the clubhouse according to what we believed were appropriate standards. The fire marshal's inspection revealed that those standards were not sufficient. We're correcting the situation now." I had been standing toward the side, trying to stay out of the spotlight, but I noticed people turning to look at me. Finally, A woman named Sarah, who lived across the street from me, called out, "Greg, what actually happened? Give us the full story." I really did not want to be in the middle of this, but I also was not going to lie. I stepped forward slightly so everyone could hear me. Here's what happened. I installed 2 propane tanks for my outdoor kitchen. I checked the HOA bylaws first, followed all the safety codes, built a proper ventilated storage area. Brenda saw them and decided they were a safety hazard. She called the fire marshal to cite me. The fire marshal came out, inspected my setup, said it was completely compliant and safe. Then he asked to inspect the clubhouse while he was here, and that's when he found all the violations. "So Brenda caused this entire situation?" Ron asked. "Brenda called for an inspection, yes, but the violations at the clubhouse were already there. They've probably been there for years." The fire marshal was just doing his job. Brenda stood up again, her voice rising. "I was trying to protect this neighborhood. Those propane tanks could have exploded and killed someone." "The fire marshal said they were completely safe," I replied calmly. "He said I had taken extra precautions beyond the minimum requirements. This isn't about safety. This is about you trying to find something to complain about and it blowing up in your face." The crowd was clearly on my side now. People were calling for Brenda's resignation. Someone suggested the board members should have to pay for the repairs out of their own pockets since this was their failure. The meeting was devolving into chaos. Patricia banged a gavel on the folding table, trying to restore order. "Everyone, please. We need to focus on moving forward. The board will take responsibility for this situation, but the fact remains that we need to fix these violations. The special assessment is necessary." "What if we don't pay it?" someone asked. "Then the HOA will place a lien on your property, which could eventually lead to foreclosure. It's in your CC and artiques. You agreed to it when you bought your home." That sobered people up a bit. Nobody wanted to risk their home over $175, no matter how angry they were about the principle of the thing. A woman named Teresa, who was an attorney, stood up. "I want to see the complete inspection report from the fire marshal. I want to see documentation of all the clubhouse maintenance that's been done over the past 5 years. And I want an independent audit of the HOA's finances to make sure the money we've been paying has been used appropriately. If it turns out the board has been negligent in their duties, then we should be exploring legal remedies." There were murmurs of agreement from the crowd. Patricia looked increasingly uncomfortable. "We can certainly provide those documents. I'll make sure they're available for review within the next week. And I think we need to hold a vote of no confidence in the current board," Teresa continued. "This situation represents a serious failure of leadership. We should be electing new board members who will actually maintain our community facilities properly." More agreement from the crowd. Patricia tried to argue that a vote of no confidence was not provided for in the bylaws. But Teresa pointed out that the bylaws did allow for the removal of board members by a majority vote of the homeowners in certain circumstances, including gross negligence. The meeting continued for another hour, getting increasingly heated. By the end, the following had been agreed upon. The board would provide all requested documentation within 1 week. An independent audit of the HOA finances would be conducted. A special election would be held in 30 days to potentially replace some or all of the board members. And the special assessment would proceed as planned, but any board members found to have been negligent could potentially be held personally liable for reimbursing the homeowners. As people dispersed, many of them came up to me to express support or sympathy. A few thanked me for exposing the problem, even though that had not been my intention. A couple of people suggested I should run for the board myself, which I politely declined. I had no desire to spend my time dealing with neighborhood politics. Amy and I walked home together under the streetlights. "That was intense," she said. "Yeah, I have a feeling things are going to get worse before they get better." Over the next week, the situation continued to escalate in ways I had not anticipated. The inspection report from Marshal Chen was made available to all residents, and it was damning. Page after page of violations, many of them described as serious or potentially life-threatening. The photos included in the report showed clear evidence of neglect: expired safety equipment, blocked exits, exposed wiring, and the gas leak that was visible in the image with the right equipment. The maintenance records for the clubhouse were even more revealing. The last professional inspection had been in 2019, 6 years ago. Since then, only basic cleaning and minor repairs had been done. There was no evidence of any systematic safety checks or preventative maintenance. Several residents on the review committee noted that requests for repairs or concerns about the clubhouse had been dismissed by the board as unnecessary expenses. The financial audit revealed that the HOA had been spending money on things like landscaping upgrades and new holiday decorations, while deferring essential maintenance on the clubhouse. The reserve fund that was supposed to be for major repairs had been kept at minimum levels, with excess funds being redirected to discretionary projects that made the neighborhood look nicer, but did not address actual infrastructure needs. The community was furious. An online forum that had been set up for the neighborhood was flooded with angry posts. People were calling for criminal charges against the board members. Someone started a petition to sue the HOA for negligence. The local newspaper got wind of the story and sent a reporter to interview residents. I tried to stay out of the spotlight as much as possible, but the reporter tracked me down at my house on a Saturday morning. Her name was Jennifer Wu, and she was a young journalist who covered local community news. "Mr. Hamilton, I understand you're at the center of this controversy," she said, holding up her phone to record our conversation. "I'm really not," I said. "I just wanted to grill some steaks," she laughed. "But your propane tanks were what started this whole chain of events." "How do you feel about what's happened?" I thought about it for a moment. "Honestly, I'm glad the violations were discovered before someone got hurt. I'm not happy about the special assessment or the neighborhood drama, but if that clubhouse had caught fire during an event with 100 people inside, it could have been a tragedy. So in that sense, I guess something good came out of this." "You think the board should resign?" "I think that's up to the homeowners to decide. I'll vote in the special election like everyone else, but I'm not going to tell people how they should vote." The interview ended up being part of a larger article about HOA governance issues in the Las Vegas area. Sunset Ridge was featured prominently as a case study in what happens when volunteer board members lack the expertise or diligence to properly maintain community facilities. The article was published on the newspaper's website and was shared widely on social media. That brought a new level of attention to our neighborhood. I started getting emails and messages from people in other HOAs who had similar experiences. A few lawyers reached out to offer their services for potential lawsuits. A local news station sent a camera crew to film the boarded-up clubhouse with a "closed by order of fire marshal" sign on the door. Brenda, unsurprisingly, did not handle the attention well. She sent out an email to all residents claiming that she was being unfairly scapegoated and that everyone should be thanking her for discovering the violations. The email was so tone-deaf and defensive that it only made people angrier. Several residents replied, all with scathing responses pointing out that she had not discovered anything. She had tried to harass a neighbor and accidentally triggered a real inspection. 2 weeks after the initial inspection, I was working in my garage when a Henderson Police Department cruiser pulled up in front of my house. My heart rate spiked for a moment, wondering what could possibly be happening now. An officer stepped out and approached me. "Are you Greg Hamilton?" he asked. "Yes, sir. Is there a problem?" "I need to ask you a few questions about an allegation that's been made. Do you have a few minutes?" I invited him into my living room and we sat down. He pulled out a notebook and explained that Brenda Montgomery had filed a complaint claiming that I had deliberately sabotaged the clubhouse to make the HOA look bad, and that I had possibly bribed the fire marshal to issue false citations. I stared at him for a moment, genuinely speechless. That's insane. I've never even been inside the clubhouse's maintenance areas. I had nothing to do with any of those violations, and I certainly didn't bribe anyone. Deputy Marshal Chen can confirm that I never even spoke to him before the day he came out for the inspection. The officer nodded, making notes. "That's what I figured, but I have to follow up on complaints. Do you have any proof of your whereabouts when the alleged sabotage might have occurred?" "I work from home. My wife can confirm I'm here most days. We have a Ring doorbell that records everyone who comes and goes. I can pull up the footage if you need it." "That won't be necessary right now. I'll need to speak with Deputy Marshal Chen and verify some details. But between you and me, this complaint seems pretty clearly retaliatory. Mrs. Montgomery is not doing herself any favors." After the officer left, I called Marcus to vent about the latest development. "She actually accused me of sabotaging the clubhouse. Can you believe that? That's defamation, man. You could sue her for that. I just want this whole thing to be over. I'm so tired of the drama." "Well, the special election is coming up soon, right? Once Brenda's off the board, things should calm down." I hoped he was right, but I was starting to doubt whether anything about this situation would ever be calm again. The police did follow up, interviewing Deputy Marshal Chen, checking the clubhouse access logs, and reviewing the timeline of events. They concluded that there was no evidence whatsoever to support Brenda's allegations and closed the complaint without any charges. The officer who had interviewed me called to let me know and mentioned that Brenda had been warned about filing false police reports, but Brenda was not done. 3 days before the special election, she sent another email to all residents. This one claimed that the whole situation was part of a conspiracy to take over the HOA board, and that several residents, including me, were working together to discredit the current leadership. She named names and made specific allegations about people's motives and actions. That was the final straw for many residents. Teresa, the attorney, sent a cease and desist letter to Brenda on behalf of several people named in the email, threatening a defamation lawsuit if she did not retract her statements and apologize. Ron from 3 streets over filed a formal complaint with the HOA board requesting Brenda's immediate removal. Even Patricia, who had generally supported Brenda, sent an email distancing herself from Brenda's statements and saying they did not represent the views of the board as a whole. The special election was held on a Saturday in late April. The voting took place at the local community center since our clubhouse was still closed. The turnout was the highest anyone could remember for an HOA election, with over 80% of households represented. When the results were tallied that evening, it was a landslide. All 5 existing board members were voted out. Patricia received the most votes to stay among the old board, but even she fell short of the 50% threshold needed to retain her seat. Brenda received the fewest votes, with several people writing in comments on their ballots expressing their anger at her behavior. The new board members were a mix of people who had been vocal at the emergency meeting and some others who had kept a lower profile, but were respected in the community. Teresa, the attorney, was elected as the new president. Ron became vice president. The other three positions went to people I knew only casually, but who seemed reasonable and competent. The first action of the new board was to formally apologize to me for the harassment related to my propane tanks, and to confirm in writing that my setup was approved, and there would be no further complaints or restrictions. The second action was to hire contractors to begin the clubhouse repairs. The third action was to retain a lawyer to explore whether the old board members could be held personally liable for the costs related to their negligence. That last part opened up a new chapter in the saga. The lawyer reviewed all the documentation and concluded that there was a strong case for negligence, particularly against Brenda and Patricia as the two most senior board members. They had been explicitly warned about some of the clubhouse issues in the past and had failed to act. Under Nevada law, HOA board members could be held personally liable for gross negligence or willful misconduct. The lawyer sent demand letters to all 5 former board members, seeking reimbursement for the full cost of the repairs and fines, which had now ballooned to $42,000 after additional problems were discovered during the renovation work. 3 of the former board members settled quickly, agreeing to pay their proportional share. Patricia negotiated a settlement that required her to pay about 30% more than a simple fifth of the total, acknowledging her greater responsibility as president. Brenda refused to settle. She insisted she had done nothing wrong and that this was all a witch hunt. The HOA board voted to file a lawsuit against her personally, and she countersued for defamation and wrongful removal from the board. The lawsuits dragged on for months. I was deposed as a witness, which involved spending 3 hours in a conference room answering questions from lawyers about every detail of the propane tank situation. It was tedious and frustrating, but I answered everything honestly and completely. During my deposition, Brenda's attorney tried to paint me as the villain, suggesting that I had deliberately provoked the inspection knowing it would cause problems for the HOA. I explained, for what felt like the 100th time, that I had simply installed propane tanks according to the rules and safety codes, and that I had no way of knowing the clubhouse was full of violations. The attorney pushed back, but I stuck to the facts. The clubhouse repairs were completed in June, 3 months after the initial inspection. The grand reopening was a community event with free food and drinks. Deputy Marshal Chen was invited as the guest of honor, and he gave a brief speech about fire safety that was actually interesting and informative. He re-inspected the building and signed off on all the work, officially clearing the clubhouse for public use again. By then, the special assessment had been paid by all but a handful of residents, and the HOA's finances were back on track. The new board had implemented a comprehensive maintenance schedule for all community facilities and hired a professional property management company to help with oversight and compliance. The lawsuit against Brenda moved toward trial in the fall. Her countersuit had been dismissed early on when the judge ruled that her removal from the board had been conducted according to proper procedures, and that none of the statements made about her constituted defamation, since they were either true or protected opinions. That left only the HOA's claim against her for negligence. Brenda's defense was that she had relied on the judgment of contractors and other board members, and that she should not be held personally responsible for what was ultimately a collective failure. The HOA's position was that she had been specifically warned about safety issues and had dismissed those warnings, and that her decision to call the fire marshal about my propane tanks demonstrated that she understood the concept of fire safety, but had chosen to apply it selectively for personal reasons. The trial lasted 3 days. I testified on the first day, repeating the story of the propane tanks and the inspection. Other residents testified about complaints they had made to the board that had been ignored. The fire marshal testified about the violations he had found and the potential dangers they represented. An expert witness explained the standard of care expected for HOA board members managing public facilities. Brenda took the stand on the third day and was her own worst enemy. She became defensive and argumentative under cross-examination. She refused to accept any responsibility for the clubhouse's condition. She made snide comments about various residents, including me. At one point, she suggested that the whole thing was an overreaction and that the fire marshal had been too strict in his interpretation of the codes. That last comment seemed to particularly irritate the judge. After closing arguments, he took less than an hour to reach a verdict. He found Brenda personally liable for negligence in her duties as an HOA board member and ordered her to pay the HOA $20,000 in damages, plus court costs and attorney fees. He noted in his ruling that while HOA board members are generally protected from personal liability for good faith decisions, Brenda's pattern of behavior demonstrated a reckless disregard for the safety of community members and a selective application of her concerns about safety based on personal grudges. The total amount Brenda ended up owing was close to $30,000 once all the fees were calculated. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she had to take out a home equity loan to pay it. A few months after the trial concluded, she put her house up for sale and moved out of the neighborhood. I felt a small pang of sympathy for her, despite everything. $30,000 was a lot of money, and her life had been significantly disrupted. But she had brought it all on herself through her own choices. With Brenda gone and the new board running things smoothly, life in Sunset Ridge finally returned to normal. My propane tanks continued to work perfectly, and I grilled out regularly through the summer and fall. The clubhouse was in better shape than it had ever been, and was regularly used for community events without any safety concerns. The newspaper reporter, Jennifer Wu, did a follow-up article about the resolution of the situation. It was a much shorter piece, but it highlighted how the community had come together to address a serious problem and had reformed its governance structure to prevent similar issues in the future. Our neighborhood was now cited as a positive example instead of a cautionary tale. About a year after the initial incident, I was grilling burgers in my backyard for a small party when Teresa stopped by. She had become a friend over the course of the whole ordeal, bonding over shared frustration with the situation. "I can't believe it's been a year since the propane tank drama," she said, accepting a burger. "Feels like a lifetime ago." "And also like yesterday," I agreed. "I still get a little nervous every time I see someone from the HOA approaching my house." "Well, you have nothing to worry about from this HOA board. We actually read the rules before we try to enforce them." She took a bite of her burger and nodded approvingly. "These tanks have really improved your grilling game." That's what I kept trying to tell Brenda. But some people just want to find problems. Speaking of which, did you hear that she's moved to Arizona? I heard she left town, but I didn't know where she went. Yep, Scottsdale. I guess she decided she needed a fresh start. I felt that small pang of sympathy again, but it was quickly overwhelmed by relief. Brenda being in another state meant I would never have to deal with her particular brand of HOA tyranny again. The party continued into the evening, with neighbors stopping by throughout the afternoon and night. People brought food and drinks. Kids played in the yard, and we celebrated nothing in particular, except the fact that we lived in a community that had learned how to work together instead of tearing each other apart. Marcus showed up with his wife and kids around sunset. "Hey man, remember when I told you those propane tanks would be fine?" "I do remember that. You were right. I'm always right about building codes. That's literally my job." He looked around at the party. "Seems like things worked out pretty well in the end. Eventually. There was a lot of drama in between. But you got a good story out of it. How many people can say their HOA called the fire marshal on them and ended up getting their own clubhouse shut down? I'd trade the story for having not gone through the stress. But you wouldn't have gotten to meet all these people and build this community." He gestured at the yard full of neighbors talking and laughing. "Before the propane tank thing, did you even know most of these people's names?" He had a point. Before the controversy, I had been friendly with my immediate neighbors, but had not really connected with the broader community. The shared experience of dealing with the HOA crisis and reforming the board had brought people together in a way that regular neighborhood events never had. "I guess there's a silver lining to everything," I conceded. As the evening wore on and people gradually headed home, Amy and I cleaned up the yard together. We had moved to Sunset Ridge 3 years earlier, attracted by the desert views and the promise of a well-maintained community. The reality had been more complicated than we had expected, but we had weathered the storm and come out stronger on the other side. "You ever think about moving?" Amy asked as we carried plates into the house. "After everything that happened, I wouldn't blame you if you wanted to start over somewhere else." I thought about it for a moment, looking around at our house and yard. The propane tanks sat in their ventilated enclosure, working exactly as they should. The outdoor kitchen had become the center of our social life. The neighbors who had supported me through the ordeal had become genuine friends. "No," I said, "I like it here. We've built something good. Why would we leave now?" She smiled and kissed me on the cheek. "Good. I like it here too." The next few months passed quietly, which was exactly what I wanted. The HOA board functioned smoothly under Teresa's leadership. The clubhouse hosted regular events without incident. The special assessment was paid off, and the reserve fund was being rebuilt with better planning and oversight. Life in Sunset Ridge was finally what we had hoped it would be when we first moved in. I did have one final encounter related to the whole situation. I was at Home Depot in Henderson picking up supplies for a small landscaping project when I ran into Deputy Marshal Chen in the plumbing aisle. "Mr. Hamilton," he said, recognizing me immediately. "How are those propane tanks working out?" "Perfectly, sir. No problems at all. Glad to hear it. And how's the neighborhood doing? I saw the articles about all the drama that followed. Things have settled down." "New HOA board, clubhouse is fixed and running great. We're in a much better place now." He nodded approvingly. "Good. You know, that was one of the stranger calls I've responded to in my career. Usually when people call about propane tanks, there's actually something wrong with them. Your setup was so obviously safe that I knew immediately something else was going on. I appreciate you taking the time to inspect the clubhouse. Who knows how long those violations would have gone unnoticed otherwise. Just doing my job, but I'm glad it worked out for the best. Too often these HOA situations just fester and get worse. It's good to hear that your community actually took action and fixed the problems." We chatted for a few more minutes about fire safety and community maintenance, and then went our separate ways. As I loaded my landscaping supplies into my truck, I reflected on the entire experience and what I had learned from it. The whole situation had taught me several important lessons. First, that standing up for yourself when you know you're right is important, even if it causes conflict in the short term. If I had just removed the propane tanks when Brenda first complained, the clubhouse violations would never have been discovered, and the building would have remained a dangerous hazard. Second, that communities need engaged members who are willing to hold leadership accountable. The old HOA board had gotten away with neglecting the clubhouse for years because most residents were not paying attention. It took a crisis to wake everyone up and drive meaningful change. Third, that sometimes the best outcome comes from the most unexpected places. I had never wanted to be at the center of an HOA controversy, but the end result was a safer, more engaged, and more functional community. Over the following year, I occasionally got messages from people in other neighborhoods dealing with their own HOA issues. Word had spread about what happened in Sunset Ridge, and I had apparently become something of an accidental expert on HOA reform. I always gave the same advice: document everything, know your rights, stand firm when you're in the right, and try to build coalitions with other reasonable homeowners. Most HOA problems, I had learned, came down to a small number of people with too much power and too little oversight. The solution was to get more people involved and to demand transparency and accountability. The anniversary of the propane tank incident came and went without much fanfare. I did grill steaks that evening in commemoration, and Amy and I toasted to surviving what we now jokingly called the HOA wars. The steaks were perfect, cooked on a grill powered by propane tanks that had been the catalyst for positive change in our community. As I stood in my backyard that evening, watching the sun set over the desert and listening to the sounds of the neighborhood settling in for the night, I felt genuinely content. The journey had been stressful and frustrating and occasionally infuriating, but it had led to a better place. The community was stronger. The leadership was better. The facilities were safer. And I had learned that sometimes defending your right to grill a steak could lead to unexpected consequences that made everyone's lives better. The propane tanks hummed quietly, doing their job without drama or incident, exactly as they had been designed to do. Brenda was in Arizona, probably finding new things to complain about. Patricia had learned her lesson about proper oversight and had actually apologized to me personally a few months after the trial. The other former board members had moved on with their lives, presumably more aware of their responsibilities if they ever served in leadership roles again. And me. I was just a guy who wanted to grill some steaks in peace. I had gotten that, eventually, along with a whole lot more than I had bargained for. But in the end, it had been worth it. The steaks tasted better knowing they were cooked on equipment that had been properly vetted and approved. The community felt more like home knowing that people actually cared about each other and about maintaining common spaces safely. And life felt more satisfying knowing that standing up for what was right, even in something as seemingly trivial as propane tanks, could make a real difference. As darkness fell and the stars began to appear in the Nevada sky, I went inside to join Amy for the evening. The propane tanks sat silent in their ventilated enclosure, waiting for the next time I needed them, certified safe by the fire marshal and approved by the HOA. Tomorrow would bring whatever it would bring, but tonight, everything was exactly as it should be. The long, strange journey from a simple backyard improvement project to an HOA revolution was complete, and I could finally just enjoy my outdoor kitchen in peace, knowing that sometimes the most mundane home improvements can lead to the most extraordinary community transformations.